Okay, carrying on from that. Due to the increase in the number of poor, in 1723, a new law passed called the Workhouse Test Act of 1723, in which those who wished to claim benefits and relief as poor now had to enter a workhouse, being essentially a prison for men, women, and children, to perform some set work. To ensure that all poor were accounted and could be identified, new laws were also introduced to force the paupers to wear a P on their right shoulder as a mark of their status. This is both the origin of the P still as a marker on modern passports and other official documents, and the P worn by prisoners from the 20th century. Okay, so there you go. You get to wear a P to indicate that the church owns you. Okay, beginning in 1773 with the Enclosure Act 1773, followed by the Enclosure Consolidation Act of 1801, English Parliament effectively privatised massive amounts of common land for the benefit of a few, causing huge numbers of land peasants to become landless paupers, and therefore in need of parish assistance. The Enclosure Acts are the foundation of land title as it is known today. Because of the deliberate legal theft of land under parliamentary enclosure laws of the late 18th and early 19th century, the numbers of paupers dramatically increased. This led to the most awful and cruel laws being introduced to deliver to an elite few the slave labour force needed for the Industrial Revolution through the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which effectively stated that the poor could not receive any benefit unless they were constantly employed in a workhouse prison. Thus, despite international treaties against slavery, the very worst slavery being wage slavery or lawful slavery was born, whereby men, women and children lived in terrible conditions and were worked to death. Well, that's not much different to what we have today. In Australia, we would call that Workhouse Test Act the New Start Allowance, where you would be fully investigated to see what and why you were not working and what could possibly be put into place to get you working. God forbid should you stay home and look after your children or grow your own vegetables or be a musician in a public place, which there's not even a place to do music pretty much these days in a public place if that was just your craft. There's signs up everywhere saying everything's private property and you're not allowed to stop there. Okay, so I'm just putting this one up again because this is where, you're born and you go into this system and they want you to be working for that money that they've put into action, so you can come and borrow it and pay it back, and why on earth shouldn't you be working? Goodness knows you can't be daydreaming about life and creating anything positive. So, beginning in 1834, a number of historic changes were introduced to the record keeping of births, deaths and marriages, the issuance of documents and the management of the poor. In 1834, British Parliament introduced Poor Law Amendment Act, which reorganised Church of English parishes into unions which would then be responsible for the poor in their area and administered by a board of poor law guardians, also known as the Board of Guardians. The clerks of magistrate courts still hold the power of a clerk of the Board of Guardians. And in 1835, the Municipal Corporations Act was introduced, which effectively standardised the corporate model for towns and boroughs, including making the municipality with elected officials responsible for data collection and service administration. And in 1836, the Births, Deaths Registration Act was introduced, which for the first time created the General Register Office and the requirement for uniform records of births, deaths and marriages across the empire by municipal councils and unions of parishes. Thus, in 1 July 1837, The birth certificates was formed as the successor of the settlement certificate for all paupers disenfranchised of their land birthright to be considered lawful, that is voluntary, slaves, with benefits provided by the local parish region underwritten by the Society of Lloyds as it is still today. Right, so your resources go into this environment, and the only way then that you can really sort of get them back is to do what they tell you to do. Well, of course, all that is changing now, but that is what it has been. So all our relatives and for a lot of us, our lives have been tied up in this system where if you wanted access to resources, you had to go and slave your guts out, even in some dead-end, boring job that sent you around the twist. Right, carrying on from that, beginning from 1871, further historic changes in the administration of vital statistics, such as birth certificates and death certificates, with the introduction of health districts or sanitary districts. And I'll just stop and say there briefly, myself as a professional astrologer, it is really vitally important that one has their birth time if they want to generate obviously their birth chart, and yet and although this elite have always used astrology to go to war and not go to war and all the rest of their shenanigans that they get up to, they deem it unnecessary that when a person is born that their birth time would be recorded. I have so many clients who cannot find their birth time, and they're thinking, oh, it's going to be on my birth certificate, and it's not. So then you're left being this lost soul on the planet in some ways. If you wanted to get your birth certificate, well, you can't very easily. But kinesiology can sometimes find your birth time for you, for anyone that is ever stuck wanting to find out their birth time but feel that they've been thwarted. All right, carrying on. Government Act of 1871, Public Health Act 1872 and Public Health Act 1875 created a system of districts called sanitary districts governed by a sanitary authority responsible for various public health matters, including mental health, legally known as sanity. Two types of sanitary districts were created, being urban and rural, while the sanitary districts were abolished in 1894 with the Local Government Act of 1894. The administration of the poor is still maintained in part under the concept of district health boards of guardians, including magistrates and other justices of the peace. Yeah, it's ridiculous. I've just been through the family court, full-on domestic violence completely ignored by the family court, mental health issues completely ignored by the magistrate. Magistrate hadn't read the annexures or the affidavits. It's just a complete sausage machine. It's a complete joke. And the person that pays the biggest price is the child, who spends his life bouncing back and forth between parents who were never held accountable for their bad behaviour that led to a broken family in the first place. It's disgusting. So this is the rebuilding of our tribal structures that we need to focus on doing as well. Since 1990, under the United Nations and the World Health Organizations, by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the system of issuing birth certificates as proof of a man or woman being a permanent member of the underclass has become an international system. One fundamental flaw that remains within the settlement birth certificate system for the Roman cult, or the Roman Curia, and its agents remains the fact that a settlement certificate is proof that a man or woman must have been born on the land for the certificate to have effect, regardless of convoluted subsequent presumptions of what the certificate actually represents. If a man or woman was not born on the land somewhere, a certificate could not be issued. Therefore, any rejection or return of a birth certificate as perfected evidence that a man or woman was born on the land, and support to any affidavit of truth concerning their immutable right from the divine Creator, therefore that individual cannot be deemed chattel of the law of the high seas. As I said earlier, the Roman Curia law is the law of the high seas, meaning that we were birthed through our mother's waters, and we have all been lost at sea, and The Roman Curia has salvaged us, thus making us their property. It's a ridiculous concept, but obviously highly effective when it's all kept hush-hush and nobody knows what the hell is going on. Which is why I'm doing this little piece here, going back into history so we know our history a bit better, which makes it more peaceful to step into your power as a sovereign being, because this is just a ludicrous game with our lives. As settlement certificates and later birth certificates are solely and purposefully designed to disenfranchise men and women from their rightful inheritance through voluntary enslavement and admission to being paupers, the system of birth certificates is wholly without legitimacy, a global system of organised fraud and crime and without lawful effect. The Board of Guardians, later known as Guardian Committee and simply as the Council of a county or borough, is a formal geographically bound body constituted by various public statutes granting certain legal authority and duty of care to its elected and appointed members for the physical, mental, personal and property interests of others, now commonly called wards. So we're all wards of the state. We're born in a hospital ward and we remain in the hospital ward under their system pretty much as children or abandoned or mentally unwell, which is what presumes them to require this guardianship, that we're also incompetent to look after ourselves, that it keeps the guardians in work. And, you know, on that note, to be honest, when people go out into the world and they behave foolishly, well, it just does give the guardians credibility for being there. So if everyone could grow themselves up a bit and not do silly things like drinking and driving and consuming ridiculous amounts of alcohol and creating children and walking out the front door and leaving them in a broken family, or perhaps throwing them out the front door and leaving them as a broken family, that would be a super good start for us cleaning up humanity and really getting clear that we do not need this kind of management. In lots of ways, the drugs, alcohol, sex and debauchery, the extreme poverty and emotional landscape that flows from that extreme poverty is what fuels this whole system. So we all need to be smart enough to let go of all of those vices that keep us trapped in this nightmare mess. You know, don't have children and leave them. Don't have arguments with the other parent. Work it out. Don't consume drugs and alcohol. It's a waste of your life. Have the odd bit here and there, but, you know, basically you're meant to be an elevated being without too much substance intake. Okay, in the most Western nations today, the Board of Guardians is effectively the town, city, borough or borough council. In 1834, British Parliament introduced the Poor Law Amendment Act, which reorganised Church of England parishes into unions, which were then to be responsible for the poor in their area and administered by a Board of Poor Law Guardians, also known as the Board of Guardians. The board was assisted by a new office known as the Clerk of the Board of Guardians, also known as the Clerk of the Guardians, being an additional title granted to the existing local clerk of the peace, responsible for administering the records and matters of the magistrates' court of the area. So if you find yourself in front of the magistrate, you're basically in front of the priest at the church. And if you find yourself in front of the judge at the court, you're definitely in front of the priest at the church. Right. The Clerk of the Peace, assuming the powers of the Clerk of the Guardians as well as the Clerk of the Magistrates from 1836 onwards, was granted even greater power as the Registrar of the Court of Record and responsible for the accurate recording of births, deaths, marriages and events within the parish union. Importantly, the Clerk of the Guardians was said to be in custody of all the poor rolls on account of their name being registered at birth. There you go, so we're already in custody. Right, I'll finish there and set up a new one. Thank you for getting to the end of this history that I'm presenting today.